Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here at the American Enterprise Institute. Please, if you don't mind, silence your phones. If they go off, they will be confiscated by our burly staff. We are very privileged to have with us Ambassador Carlos Trujillo, the U.S. Permanent Representative to the Organization of American States. He represents us at the Permanent Council of that body, which is the organ responsible for making the essential important decisions in addition to the General Assembly. And he is confronting an extraordinarily busy agenda in Latin America, the Caribbean, our friends in Canada, confronting this all together, these issues, as friends, as neighbors. And we're privileged to have him here today. Ambassador Trujillo was sworn in on March 30th, 2018. He was the first political appointee of the Trump administration in the Western Hemisphere Bureau. He presented his credentials to the Secretary General on April 5th. He's a former prominent Florida attorney and politician. He served as a state representative for the 105th District in Florida. He was a founding partner of Trujillo, Vargas, Gonzalez, and Hevia in Coral Gables, Florida. And we're delighted that he's joined us here. And rather than read his bio, I thought I'd ask him, just so you get to know him a little better, about if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, about your experience, your family, please.
Thank you, Roger. It's an honor to be here. My name's Carlos Trujillo. I'm the U.S. ambassador to the OAS. It still gives me goosebumps to say that every once in a while. I'm the son of Cuban immigrants. Both my parents were born in Cuba. I'm married. I have 4 children. I went to law school at Florida State and was a prosecutor for 4 years in Miami, handling up to homicide cases. After that, I started my own law firm and ran for state representative, a post that I held until March when I resigned in order to accept this post. The last job I had as a state representative, I was the budget chair. The state of Florida has a roughly $87 billion budget. I was in charge of appropriating that for 2 years. And I've been here for roughly a month. And I can tell you, I feel like I walked in to the middle of the playoffs because you walk in right into, we had Lima. I was here for a week, take a flight down to Lima, attend the summit, come back, and we've had 2 or 3 permanent council meetings. We're heading into our General Assembly. Obviously, the Venezuelan elections are right around the corner. So there's a lot going on at a very fast speed, but I'm very, very honored and humble to be here with you all and to be in this position.
Well, I noted before to Ambassador Trujillo, but before he came along, I was the youngest ambassador of the United States to the OAS. And then I went on to become the youngest Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and you haven't assured me yet that whether you have designs on that job, but you'll at least have to wait a few years. It's interesting, the Permanent Council, because I came from working as a congressional staffer, Senate staffer, and I found that it's kind of sort of a legislative environment. Tell us a little bit about how you've acclimated yourself to that environment, to your new team meeting with your counterparts.
I think it's a very similar environment. Any political body, you have the organism in which you have to drive first an agenda and a policy and have a set of principles and ideals that you're committed to and trying to advance those. And at the same time, you have to build consensus and you have to build the votes. So my time at the Florida House, we had our agenda and it takes time to define it and to craft it and to execute on it. But if you have an inability to build friends and to build consensus and to build like-minded people to support it, you're not really effective. So they both go hand in hand. And throughout my limited time at the OAS, I've seen that we somewhat have an idea of our vision and our agenda. Now it's really continuing to work on building the consensus in order to achieve it. And that's from the political side. And I think from the budgetary side, my background really is budget. I served also on the board of the 4th largest hospital in the United States during a financial crisis. So I understand the budgetary side of things. But I think the OAS has a lot of room for improvement. One of my focuses is going to be really on analyzing the institution as a whole and making sure that, first and foremost, it's a good return for the American taxpayer and that there's longevity in the institution, that the decisions we make today are really going to put the institution in a better place in 2 and 4 and 10 years, which I think there's a lot of work to be done as to that end.
We'll get down to those nitty-gritty issues. Let's stay at 30,000 feet, if we could. The State Department is now under new management. Your new boss, Mike Pompeo, arrived very recently and is beginning to put his own team in place. I'm not sure whether you've had an opportunity to interact with him, but can you give us some insights on his perceptions of Latin America, what his priorities will be, how that reflects President Trump's mandate to him?
I haven't had an opportunity to interact with him. He was at the building this week, and our schedules haven't coincided. I'm sure he's also very busy with a lot of other things that are forthcoming. But I think the president's agenda, on which the secretary will carry out, it really is a restoration of democracy and human rights in the region. And some of the biggest violators in Venezuela and Cuba, Nicaragua, those issues have to be addressed. So I think his agenda and his vision laid out by the administration now with John Bolton also working towards that end is really how do we achieve that? I think everybody agrees that we have to have human rights, we have to respect them, we have to have democracy, we have to have somewhat of a rule of law. So how do we achieve that and how do we do it as expeditiously as possible? And I'm looking forward to working with the secretary in achieving those goals, and I'm really happy that he's on board to really set the vision as we carry out that agenda.
We've been privileged to have former Director Pompeo here on this stage recently. He's a good friend of the American Enterprise Institute over the years. So, I think I share your positive expectations for what the leadership he'll bring there. And he was very explicit that President Trump engaged with him on issues regarding the Americas very early on, and I think gave some marching orders that put the U.S. on the right side in terms of that, dealing with the criminal regime in Venezuela. You just returned from the Summit of the Americas, as our event was organized about, and in the end, did it have a dramatic impact that our president wasn't there and that we were represented instead by the vice president? He's a man who's had some interaction with our leaders from the Americas already. Can you give us a sense of the tenor, the tone, that's the nature of those conversations that the vice president carried out?
I think, obviously, everybody prefers the president to be present, but given the circumstances, it was more than acceptable. But the transition was absolutely seamless. The vice president showing up, he really hit the ground running. His ability to connect at a lot of those bilateral meetings, the amount of work that he's previously put into the region in meeting with leaders in Colombia and Brazil, down in Lima, I think was very well received. It was very positive, and he has those personal relationships that he was able to connect and communicate and carry forward our agenda. One thing that he did that I thought was very powerful from the American perspective is meet with the civil society groups. He spent a significant amount of time meeting with different civil society groups, Venezuelan and Cubans and others, and their reaction to those meetings were they felt re-energized. These are groups that just 3 years ago in Panama were beaten on the streets, they were in prison, they were denied access, they were tortured at a Summit of Americas, for lack of a better word. And now, just 3 years later, they're meeting with the vice president. They're respected. Their human rights and their dignity is respected. And I thought they had a very, very positive reaction to their interactions with the vice president, to the entire summit experience.
Now, President Maduro, in the end, didn't go to Lima. His invitation had been withdrawn by the Peruvian hosts. The U.S. offered to host the next summit. Can you give us a sense of whether, for example, Diaz-Canel, the new lackey of Castro, who's the head of the Cuban government, might be invited to Washington to attend that kind of summit, or perhaps there be a new leader?
I find it difficult to accept, and I think especially given this administration's priorities, that they would invite someone like a Diaz-Canel or someone like a Maduro or someone who just blatantly violates democracies and human rights. I think the purpose of the summit is how do you build consensus and how do you strengthen democracy, not how do you destroy it. So I think given the American perspective, especially that of this administration, I find it very, very difficult that at the next summit they would be in the invite list. And I think given some of the possibilities, in '94 was in Miami, who knows where it'll be this year, I can't imagine Diaz-Canel strolling out of Miami International Airport down the tarmac and being greeted kindly.
Well, Let me just turn to Venezuela. One of the real challenges for all of us who care about security and stability in the Americas. You said in your inaugural comments as permanent representative of the United States at the OAS, today the OAS enjoys renewed credibility. It is demonstrating leadership in the collective defense of democracy and the promotion of human rights. Now, certainly, Secretary General Almagro has done a remarkable job. However, the OAS Permanent Council has passed relatively weak resolutions as Maduro has consolidated his dictatorship in Venezuela. Rather than settle for that lowest common denominator, at what point does the U.S. government and the Lima group of countries have to bless tougher measures outside of the framework of the OAS in order to confront the regime in a more effective way?
The Lima group's a reaction of the OAS's inability to carry out an agenda. We have to accept that, and I think if the OAS wants to be a credible institution, we have to be able to stick to an agenda and honor the principles which we all subscribe to. I think once we violate those principles, it creates a vacuum for the Lima group to be present. And what does the Lima group create? It's a great platform, it's a great opportunity, but it's not the OAS, and it excludes people from the conversation. So if countries think that there's no consequences to abstaining or voting against these resolutions, which is great, but now you don't have a seat at the table. You have no idea what's going on, and you have an inability to influence the outcome of something that's affecting the entire Western Hemisphere. For the OAS to have renewed credibility, how do we sit at a permanent council meeting in which we have a democratic charter, in which Venezuela sits across the table from us, and nobody questions their ability to sit there? How do we as an organization really look at ourselves in the mirror every day and say, well, Venezuela's a country that respects no democracy, that respects no human rights, yet is able to opine as to those issues in a democratic setting here in the United States of America? How do we accept that? And I think going forward, for the organization to have credibility, you have to mean what you say and say what you mean. And going forward, they have to really, all the countries have to respect the charter. And when you see something that is not aligned with the principles we all agree to, we have to hold people accountable. That's the only way to have credibility as an organization. That's the only way to really march forward.
Let's talk about what the OAS General Secretary could do on the Venezuela front, perhaps, to make some practical contributions. It hosted essentially an expert review of the systematic violations of human rights, and with the intention of making a formal referral to the ICJ to trigger an investigation of the regime's record. It has also played as an informal host to the Venezuelan Supreme Court in exile. And those judgments that Supreme Court might make in the context of a democratic transition might actually be critical at one point. In light of the fact that the democratically elected National Assembly elected landslide to the opposition in December 2015, that assembly is the authentic representative of the Venezuelan people. It seems to me much more so than the government. Would it be a possibility that the OAS General Secretary, along with some like-minded governments, might convene meetings, informal meetings of that National Assembly or members of that assembly to begin to do some preparation about what a democratic transition would look like, about what humanitarian assistance programs might look like, what the reconstruction of the country might look like, what sort of international support they might need? Is it possible that the OAS in that sort of ad hoc fashion could become more of a protagonist in favor of defining the path forward to the restoration of democratic order in Venezuela?
I think in the long run, that's definitely the OAS is a great platform to do that, but in the short time, we have to have free and democratic elections in Venezuela, and we have to be able to bring in humanitarian aid, and we've had an inability to do so. So until we accomplish those goals, the fact that there's humanitarian aid is rejected by the Venezuelan people when children don't have access to basic prenatal care, mothers don't have access to prenatal care, children don't have access to basic nutrition, diabetics don't have access to insulin, people don't have access to just the most basic of rights. We have to address that first. I think the OAS is a great platform for, it's easy to say, what's next? What's the change and how do we restore the change? But we have to get there at some point, and obviously you have to have the conversations almost bifurcated, because if you don't plan for the day after, there does create that vacuum, and it does create an ability or an inability for the government to function and meet the needs of its people. But I think our focus has to be, what's our reaction post May 20th? We all know that those elections aren't legitimate. We all know that they're sham elections. So what's going to be our reaction May 21st? How is the OAS as an organization going to react? How is the international community going to react? And how are the Venezuelan people going to react that actually have to live through that oppression?
Well, sort of my idea for trying to get the National Assembly members to start to define that path forward is precisely to help provide that answer. But so what is the answer? I mean, I had a conversation with a senior State Department official the other day who said, okay, we want elections, we've called for elections, May 20th comes and goes, nothing happens. What's the next step? What are we really expecting from the regime?
I think what we're expecting from them is status quo, but the reality is, with or without American intervention or international intervention, the place is in a downward spiral. We have to accept that they're holding back clap bags in order to try to secure votes heading into a contentious election that's already rigged, and they're still concerned about it. It shows you the state and the desperation of that regime. I think sanctions on individual members makes it even more difficult. If you're in the inner circle and you're sitting there and you're 50 years old or 40 years old or 60 years old, you think about your grandkids and your children and their ability to be able to immigrate or travel around the world, and now that inability to do so. I think that has a chilling effect. The people who are engaged in that corruption, it changes their behavior, changes their ability to contribute. But I think going forward, the reaction has to be not only the American response, but also the region's response, the OAS response, the entire world's response. The obligations, obviously, we tend to lead the way, but we're not the only ones who are responsible for the fallout. I think the entire region, really, from a targeted sanctions perspective for individuals, they should do more. I think from a sector-specific sanction perspective, the entire region should do more. And I think the United States of America is committed to doing whatever it takes to make sure that the people in Venezuela can enjoy basic human rights and some level of democracy.
I mean, I know it's kind of a tough question, but I mean, no one expects really the behavior of Nicolas Maduro and Tarek al-Assami. These guys are real thugs. They've stolen billions of dollars from the Venezuelan people that they'd rather not give up. Some of it we've confiscated. I hear we've confiscated about $500 million just from one of these individuals, which is remarkable in light of the fact that he's a public official for the last 25 years. But no one expects them to cede power voluntarily to people who might hold them accountable for their crimes. So isn't it a fact that we essentially want to continue to pressure these people until you have regime change? You have people, because they're not going to change their behavior. I mean, isn't that essentially where we are today?
I believe so. Could you imagine a Venezuela marching forward with Maduro at the reins? I think it's very, very difficult to accept that, given his track record, given his history, given the massive amounts of corruption that have taken place directly by him and by his administration. It's hard for them to be recognized ever as a legitimate form of government and of government officials. So obviously the sanctions do work in changing that behavior and hopefully curtailing that behavior. See how successful it is after the May 20th.
Well, there's a very tough decision for everybody, and that is the so-called sectoral sanctions, whether we do a prohibition on the importation of Venezuelan petroleum, or on the other hand, prohibit the export of the diluents and other precursors that are required for the regime to do any production. Those are pretty tough. What's the latest thinking, do you think? Do you think there'll be a review under Secretary Pompeo of where we are in the whole sanctions strategy? For example, I know that the Treasury has taken the lead. My impression is that the State Department has been holding back approval on, for example, sanctioning Diosdado Cabello. Do you think there might be a review of that whole strategy to get tougher, understanding that the humanitarian disaster is having a toll every day?
Absolutely. You have a deadline that they created. They created the May 20th deadline. They're 17 days away. It's really a natural marker in which there'll be a reaction to. I think, obviously, with new administrations and when new leadership come new ideas, I'm sure the Secretary has his vision of how to handle the situation, how to advance that conversation regarding Venezuela. I'm sure he'll be very effective in carrying it out. So going forward over the next 17 days, we'll see what happens in Venezuela, but also with our change in leadership and maybe our possible change somewhat in directions or reactions, we will have a different approach.
Well, you have the privilege now of working with Luis Almagro, who I think has exceeded expectations, and certainly, I believe he has, and done a remarkable job. The old expression was that some secretaries general are born to mediocrity, and others have mediocrity thrust upon them. In his case, I think he's gone beyond what anyone expected. Secretary General Insulza stood by, really, while some of these leftist regimes consolidated power. And the only time he stirred from his slumber was when Manuel Zelaya tried to hold an illegal constituente to extend the opportunity for him to run for office again. At the OAS General Assembly in Fort Lauderdale years ago, when I was ambassador to the OAS, we sought to have a mechanism that would make the OAS a more agile monitor. Actually, you were the ambassador at the OAS at the time. I was assistant secretary. And John Maystow was here. Everybody knows John. And people resisted that. And so we gradually saw more and more countries lose their democratic institutions, the checks and balances, transparency, essential respect for human rights. And the OAS hasn't played that role. Is it time to sort of reconsider some ways to get the OAS in the game earlier on in this process so that we don't wait until there are mobs in the streets trying to clamor for their essential rights?
I think Almagro has done an exceptional job to that end. Through election monitoring, you have people on the ground who are analyzing issues before they turn into protests and violence. So I think he's been very successful in positioning the organization to prevent some of the worst case scenarios of what happens when elections go bad. I think he's also raised the profile of the organization. I think it's important for a multilateral platform for people to give it credibility and people to feel that it has a function, it has an ability to solve problems across the region. And he's done a very, very good job in that. And I think from now, he sets the vision. I think any good leader will set the vision for the organization. Now it's up to the organization to march forward. His vision is for democracy in the region. His vision is for the fundamental respect of all human rights. Now it's up to the organization to live and abide by its charter. We all signed up for it. We all agreed that those are principles that we hold dear. Now it's up to us to really be accountable for our votes, for our actions, and for our statements. And hopefully this General Assembly will do just that.
Let's talk about one issue that's right in front of us in the headlines, and that's Nicaragua. 40 people killed. It's one thing for people to agitate about, economic policy like pension reform, and it's another thing altogether when 40 people are dead by brute force by the government. What's the latest what are you hearing from your colleagues about how the OAS might respond to that?
I think those people, their death shouldn't be in vain. We have to analyze what happened, who's responsible, and hold those people accountable to the fullest extent of the law. So before we even start discussing the government, we really have to analyze what happened to those individuals. Why did they perish? How can we prevent that? And who's responsible for that should really be brought to justice. And I think that the Permanent Council should start dealing with those issues at a bare minimum and investigating those casualties. And it's something that's completely unacceptable. People should have the right to protest as long as they do it peacefully. They should feel that not only their government, but the international community encourages and respects that right. So those people, their death shouldn't be in vain. I think there's been very limited reporting on what occurred and how they passed. I think it's an issue that shouldn't stop there. The organization should really take a proactive interest in analyzing that.
I mean, it's one thing for critics of Ortega to be holding forth. It's another thing when the Episcopal Conference of Bishops, most respected entity in the country, really speaks out in very blunt terms about who's responsible for those killings. A good friend of mine, trusted person, told me, frankly, the U.S. Embassy is not doing enough to reach out to other members of civil society, including some of the aggrieved people. Do you think that Secretary Pompeo would prefer a more active approach in terms of the U.S. Embassy engaging people?
No, I can't speak to what the actual embassy is doing or not doing. I haven't been privy to those conversations. But I think the U.S. approach is always going to be to stand with some of the civil society groups and make sure that they have a space in order to express their concerns. It was past secretaries, regardless of administrations, and I'm sure it's going to be our current secretary's position that there's a space for civil society. They're a great benefit, and they need to have a platform in which they could come and express their concerns, and their concerns will be listened to, and they'll be able to do it in a peaceful and respectful manner.
Well, I should congratulate you for getting confirmed by the United States Senate, and you know very well that the Congress plays an extraordinarily important role in U.S. foreign policy. For example, in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, there's a really strong bipartisan support for our basic objectives and strategy. Can you explain how you'll work to build bridges with those political leaders, where all politics is local in our Congress, with this multilateral international body?
I think it's a team approach. There has to be buy-in from everyone, not only from the OAS or the State Department, but across the executive, from all other agencies, and most importantly, from the Hill. If the Hill doesn't finance and fund the OAS, we're completely ineffective. If they don't finance and fund some of our priorities, we're completely ineffective. And they have a lot of buy-in and a lot of interest in the organization. They have a lot of buy-in, a lot of interest in democracy and human rights. So my goal, as long as I'm able to serve, is to really bring them in. We have to have a door open for them to come in, to feel that they're included, to feel that they have a seat at the table in shaping the U.S. policy. And more importantly, they have their own relationships. I think sometimes we take that for granted or we forget, but a very powerful senator calling a foreign minister, a very powerful senator even calling a president, does carry some weight. A very powerful congressman or congresswoman calling a president or foreign minister does carry some weight. So as we're working, as we've struggled sometimes to get the votes required in order to advance our agenda, those relationships and that team approach of not only the U.S. OAS or the secretary, but also the executive or the vice president or a senator or a congressman or a congresswoman calling over and helping us secure those votes, I think it's a very strong approach, especially when it's bipartisan. Because regardless of what happens in American politics, these people stick around. And regardless of the chains of administration, these are principles that hold true for the American people as a whole.
That's a promising answer. It speaks to the importance, really, of having political appointees in these jobs, with all due respect. I mean, I love the Foreign Service folks, the career people. They make you look good on a regular basis, and they defend our interests. They're patriots, and they're professionals, and they'll do an extraordinarily good job. But, you know, you're prepared to pick up the phone and call a senator. You've already made some of those calls, I understand. Get them involved. And a lot of times, in my experience in the State Department, including when I was a low-level munchkin, frankly, the people in the department didn't even want to call and ask for fear what the answer might be. And more often than not, members of Congress, senators appreciate the opportunity to get involved and help. Democrats or Republicans, political appointees can have an important role to play. One of the accomplishments of a career Foreign Service officer who preceded you was on the important issue of burden sharing. I think it was probably Kevin Sullivan's work and his team's work that got us to this elusive goal of setting a limit on the percentage at which any country could contribute to the OAS. That is to say, not more than 50%. Of course, we're the only country that comes close to that. And so in the spirit of burden sharing, and where a country wouldn't have sort of undue disproportionate influence in the organization over its budget, they set that cap at 50%. That's right, and that's by the way a tribute to the FSOs who got that work done in the absence of a political ambassador or a confirmed ambassador. So the problem with that is that countries can achieve that objective by cutting the budget, which would be a mess. It would be a disaster. I see Steve Greiner here, who's the president of the OAS Staff Association, elected in a landslide. Not quite a Castro landslide, but a landslide. And he knows this very well. So, how do we prevent the solution to this being cutting the budget, and instead having countries step up and contribute more?
First, I think Kevin and the entire team did an exceptional job negotiating with other countries and saying we can't contribute more than 50% because there has to be buy-in. Everybody has to feel that they have some skin in the game. Everybody has to feel that they are a part of the OAS. And when our contribution is 60% and then all of our voluntary contributions, it can't just be the United States' organization. It has to be the Western Hemispheric organization. So Kevin being able to achieve that goal was monumental. It really was. From the longevity of the institution, of having a lot of buy-in from a lot of people, knowing that they're invested in the institution, and also for the American taxpayer perspective. Why should we pay 60% of the bill when some other countries really aren't paying much? So I think that was a historic and monumental change in the culture and in the atmosphere at the OAS, and Kevin and the entire team is single-handedly responsible for that. They were able to achieve that. And now the conversation going forward, how do we achieve the 50% and who's responsible for the difference? It's obviously going to be up to the organization to decide. I think from the American perspective, it's irresponsible to just cut the organization. If just cutting the organization sends a message that we don't care. It's easy to just cut the budget, and it's an irresponsible approach. Could the organization be more efficient and effective? Absolutely. But those efficiencies and effective changes should go into reserves. The organization struggles with some reserves. They should go into deferred maintenance. That's where we should try to maximize that. But cutting the budget across the board really limits our ability to be effective. And it's something that hopefully the majority of the member states take into consideration as we negotiate the quotas and ultimately as we negotiate the budget. If we really care about the organization and we really find value in it, what people have to pay is a very insignificant amount compared to other multilateral organizations. And the return on investment for some countries is exponential. We're a donor country. The majority of the countries are massive beneficiaries of the programs and the platform that we've helped create, and they've obviously contributed to. But I think the vision for the organization going forward is not just a massive cut of the budget. I think it's a very irresponsible way to approach a budget conversation. It's really how do we have more buy-in? How do we have more people and more governments invested in this organization? And how are we able to maximize those resources to achieve the goals that we all have?
Excellent. And one of the things, one of the challenges here is to make sure that the U.S. doesn't make across-the-board cuts among our international organization contributions. What's your strategy for ensuring that happens? And for that matter, having bureaus in the State Department put, voluntary contributions into specialized organizations like SEACDAY and CCAD and seconding personnel. So the U.S. really is engaged, integrated with the OAS agenda on these important priorities.
I think it goes back to having strong relationships with the Hill. You have to be able to advocate for these organizations, and you have to be able to show that it's a good investment for the American taxpayer. Does it advance the American agenda? Does it advance our American interests? And if the answer is yes, we should continue to contribute. But at the same time, I think there has to be a full review of all these organizations. If we're contributing money and we see a poor return or a poor investment, or we're not advancing the American agenda, why are we doing so? So I think across the board, really reviewing every organization independently and making sure that they stand on their own 2 feet as an organization, and working collaboratively with Capitol Hill really could help us in achieving some of our goals. Coming from a legislative background, I really appreciate and understand the importance that elected officials play. They're sent up here to represent their constituency. They are as close to the American public as anybody. and they understand the difficulties in appropriating a limited amount of resources in order to meet all the goals and expectations of the American people. So I think we always have to take those considerations into account. And when we send money somewhere, we're taking it from someone, and we're not putting it in another place. That's a consideration that I'm very cognizant of as a taxpayer, as an American, and as a former politician. We have to be very diligent in our spending, and we have to be very good in communicating the needs for that spending.
We're going to take questions in a second from the audience. The young lady in the back has a microphone, and she will pass it to people as I recognize them. But let me just ask on that subject. You also mentioned in your inaugural statement that I believe our focus should be on strengthening the core competencies of the institution. A lot of us believe that those core competencies are political, human rights, those maybe some security issues like drugs and terrorism. But the OAS has some far-flung programs, some of them that are just scratching the itch of some rather small countries. I'm not saying abandon those ideas, those programs, but are there other ways that we can work with the IDB or the World Bank to have them take up some of the slack on those economic programs and have the OAS focus, as you say, on the core competencies?
I think one thing for any institution is you can't be all things to all people. And I think the OAS has to accept that, and I think any organization has to accept that. Once you try to do a lot of things, you probably end up doing them very poorly. So we have to figure out what are the things we do well, and how do we invest in developing and scaling those things so that they're even more efficient and more successful. And what are the things that we do poorly? And why are we continuing to make bad investment or bad choices on programs that don't give us the return that we anticipated or a return that's appropriate? So I don't want to say that we're going to eliminate some or add new ones, but I think just overall reviewing what's the mission of the organization, how do you accomplish that mission, and what are the resources that are necessary to accomplish that mission is one thing that I'm going to focus on. I really want to spend a lot of time focusing on the budget and sustainability of the organization. I think trying to do a lot of things very poorly is probably not in our best interest.
We'll go to Juan Jose Dawu, this gentleman here, ask a question. Please identify yourself, your affiliations, and you can ask a long-winded question. Others can.
Thank you, Ambassador. Congratulations, Ambassador Trujillo. I'm from El Salvador, former Minister of Finance there and former Managing Director of the World Bank. I heard Ambassador ask about Venezuela, and I saw your speech about Venezuela. Venezuela has contaminated many of our countries, just as Cuba did in the 80s and before. And in the case of El Salvador in particularly, we have not trusted as much the OAS in the past. I think things are definitely changing. Hopefully, you will keep it at the top of the agenda. Concretely, El Salvador is a country that went from hardship to investment grade in a relatively short period of time when it took the right decisions and had the right leadership. We really didn't need much help from the outside world once we had that leadership in place. So it works, and it's less of a burden to countries like the United States when you have the right people in place. So investing in somehow creating the conditions for the wrong people to depart is actually a good return on investment. And I will encourage you to keep El Salvador in mind, and for that matter, a few other countries in the region. The question is, provided the limited resources that traditionally the OAS has had, and what you were just talking about, the flavor of the month approach that sometimes these organizations take, I think that monitoring elections and investing prior to the elections in cleaning up the voting documents and all of this is an investment worthwhile making that will reduce the investments later on. And so do you see that as really playing an important role as you go to the reallocation of the budget, and also in the missions that monitor the elections on the D-Day, which in some countries can make the difference between someone stealing the election or a good election taking place?
I think that's one of the things we do well. I think the OAS, one thing they've historically done well is election monitoring. And if our goal is to encourage democracies and to really help some of the fragile democracies in the region, how do you do that? People have to have confidence that when they vote, the elections aren't going to be rigged and that the outcomes are going to be respected. So how do we accomplish that is by giving them that certainty that regardless of the victor of the election, but we're going to invest the money to make sure that they're fair, that they're legitimate, that they're recognized, and that they're just in their outcome.
There's a gentleman right there. Then I'm going to go to this lady and then. Yeah.
Difference that would have made nowadays. In Venezuela, 97% of all export revenues goes directly to the government. In Venezuela, 40% of the poorest in Venezuela got less than 15% of what should have been their share had they just gotten their per capita revenue stream from the oil. Why is this never an issue that's on the forefront? Because that is really transformative for an oil-cursed nation. Thank you.
I think it's something that's being explored. Nobody's under any false pretense that the Petrovesa money is taken and distributed and encouraged the corruption of the country. I think everybody accepts that as pretty definitive. So how do you stop that money from coming in, and how do you stop and eliminate that corruption? And how do you ultimately change the behavior of those individuals to recognize that they're going to be held accountable? I think those are the difficult discussions and conversations that at the State Department, the United States government, the international community is going to have over the next few weeks leading up to May 20th and after May 20th. But I think it's an issue that is definitely being explored. It's definitely being reviewed. And I think it ultimately will find its proper solution.
The governments should not run oil companies, and Congresses shouldn't either. Whether it's Mexico or Brazil, this is a disaster that's occurred everywhere. Venezuela is a worse scenario, obviously. But one of the things we might ask when there's a review of sanctions strategy is whether you should prohibit the import of Venezuelan oil until the Secretary of State can certify that the proceeds go to benefit the people. And then we might, just this lady down front. And then I'm going to go to John. We'll go to...
Hello, I'm Alex Valderrama with Chevron. Thank you so much for your words, and Roger for your questions, and lots of success in your new role. I have two questions for you. The first one is, I think it's the news on that now the U.S. will be contributing 50% to 60% to the OAS and others so that they have more skin in the game. My question is, since that's changing, will the weight in voting for each country change as well? Or will that stay the same?
Every country gets one vote.
Right, but so it has the same.
Has the same. It would be great if we get 60% of the votes. I can tell you we wouldn't lose a single resolution.
Right. Okay, yeah, because a lot of initiatives that we've heard of have been stopped because of that weight. So my question was that. And the second question is on, our understanding is that Secretary General Almagro and his team have been working on a report to the ICC on crimes against humanity for the Venezuelan government. If you have any information on that, on where that is, where it is at this point. Thank you.
I know they're working on that, and I think the people who've done an exceptional amount of work is the Supreme Court in exile, prosecutors in exile. They've done a great job of documenting all the crimes against humanity and really building the case for individuals that are responsible, memorializing testimony, identifying victims, and preparing that so that at some point these individuals can be brought to justice. So I think it's a collaborative group, not only the OAS and the Secretary General, but Venezuelans in exiles, prosecutors in exile, judges in exile that are working together in Bogota. A few months ago, they actually held a tribunal on some of the Venezuelan regime members that have committed crimes against humanity. and brought forth victims in order to memorialize that testimony, and even invited the Venezuelan government to come and defend themselves. So that is taking place, and I think it has to continue to take place. Because one thing that happens is time kind of heals all wounds, but people should ultimately be held accountable. And if you violated somebody's human rights, if you tortured somebody, if you improperly imprisoned somebody, you should be brought to justice, regardless if it's been 2 weeks or 2 years or 20 years. So hopefully through these exercises, those individuals' tortures are ultimately brought to justice.
I think he's playing your song. Jose Miguel Vivanco.
Ambassador Trujillo, Jose Miguel Vivanco from Human Rights Watch. I have a question regarding Nicaragua. We have recently documented gross violations of human rights committed by security forces of Nicaragua. And the Inter-American Human Rights Commission has requested permission from the government of Nicaragua to conduct an on-site investigation. Given the degree of concentration of power in Nicaragua, the lack of independent judiciary, and the level of corruption that exists in that country, I think it's extremely unlikely that these violations of human rights are going to be subject of rigorous and objective investigation by the local officials. So the Commission has requested this permission, but I think it's also unlikely that the government of Nicaragua is going to grant authorization for the Commission to visit the country. Is your administration working with the Permanent Council to build pressure with the Permanent Council on the government of Nicaragua to press that government to accept a visit, an on-site investigation by the Inter-American Human Rights Commission?
I'll say, first of all, thank you for all your work. I know the amount of work that you personally do in your organization, and it really makes a difference in a lot of people's lives. But we agree with you that, as I said earlier, their deaths are not in vain. We will investigate this, and we will do whatever it takes. And I understand that the Nicaraguan government's not going to send you some tickets and invite you down there to investigate what occurred. But I think it's incumbent upon the Permanent Council to demand that. If we don't demand the investigation of the deaths of 30 to 40 people that were killed for absolutely no reason at the hands of whether it's police or military, but somebody at the hands of the government, what good are we as an organization? So I think the Permanent Council, that's one of the issues we should take up. We should take up the death of those individuals, and we should take up the Nicaraguan government's inability to allow credible international organizations to go in and investigate. That behavior shouldn't be acceptable and it should be condemned.
Pastor Maestro. She's bringing the microphone.
John Maestro, Mr. Ambassador, congratulations on your nomination and your being sworn in. And congratulations on your presentation today. I think we see a former legislator and lawyer in action.
Thank you.
Two thoughts. One, following up on Jose Miguel. There was a thought years ago, and Roger Noriega and I remember years ago, that perhaps a system by which when the Inter-American Human Rights Commission comes up with a country study that should result in a mission being sent to country X, whatever country, and makes such a recommendation to the Permanent Council, that the Permanent Council have an obligation to take up that report, that recommendation. There has always been resistance on the part of the Permanent Council, which is an exclusive club of executive branches that, well, it acts like an executive branch in total sovereignty. Which leads me to another question, and that is, there's been a suggestion in the past that because governments are composed of more than executive branches, there are legislative branches and judicial branches, and in Latin America, electoral branches. Wouldn't it be interesting if the legitimate Congress of Venezuela and the legitimate Supreme Court of Venezuela, which are not the ones in power in Caracas right now, had the opportunity to appear before the Permanent Council and to explain to all the countries what is going on with a challenge to the Permanent Council to address what those legitimate democratic branches of government have to say. An additional thought. Maybe had something like that been in action, the whole Honduras imbroglio might maybe have been avoided if the legislative and judicial branches had a chance to respond at the OAS to something that the OAS was dragged into later on. That's, I'm wondering if you may have detected any interest in such a thing, or whether that might be of interest to the U.S. mission in collaboration with other missions.
Well, I haven't heard this idea before, but I think it would be very open to having bona fide legitimate people who are elected by the will of their constituencies come up and testify. I think that makes all the sense in the world, having them come to the OAS, having some of the Supreme Court justices that happen to live down in Miami that I had the opportunity of meeting prior to having this job, having them come up here and document exactly what's occurring. I think there's no better source. And they're people who are legitimately elected by the constituency. So I think it's a great suggestion. It's something we should definitely explore. The first part of your question was, I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question? Absolutely, yeah. So back to the. So I think why are they creating reports that nobody reviews and nobody addresses? It's a complete waste of time, effort, energy, and money. I think we have to. I think for a lot of those reports, it's twofold the approach. There's some that are individual actors that are bad actors, and those should be treated differently than systematic failures by entire government organizations. I think systematic failures have to be addressed. If one rogue prison guard in any country in this world decides to abuse a detainee, it's a bad act, but it's not a systematic failure. It's a person who's just acting rogue and abusing their power and should be held accountable nonetheless. But how do you fix systematic failures across entire governments, across entire institutions, across entire countries and regions? Those are the issues that we should be taking up. And I think those are issues that should be reviewed. If the entire penal system is ruined, that's an issue that we should probably take some interest in. If the entire government has a repressive approach to dealing with somebody's human rights, that's an issue that we should be reviewing.
Well, very effective use of your time. We have about 6 or 8 minutes left. I promised the ambassador he'd get back on his treadmill.
Thank you. I'm Abul Gate from the Embassy of Egypt. My question is regarding that the U.S. now has a priority that was reflected very clearly in the national security strategy, which is countering the influence of, or the rise of, the Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. So my question is, does this subject is part of any deliberations inside the OAS, especially that the Secretary of the State Tillerson in the last visit has been tackling this issue with most of the states that he has visited. So does the OAS, this is a concern for it or no?
Well, I don't think the OAS will brush on this issue in particular, the Chinese influence in the region, but I think as from the American perspective, we have to make the case on why we're better partners. And we have to do a good job of communicating. You could go into business with China or you could go into business with the United States, and we have to tell them all the reasons why a deal with the United States, it's not a quid pro quo, it's not that we're going to give you something, we expect something in return. We both agree that we're going to abide by the same philosophy. We both agree that we're going to be fair in the way we transact business. And both of us are going to benefit from that relationship. And I think that's much more powerful than I'm going to come to your country, I'm going to buy your infrastructure, I'm going to buy your utilities, and then I'm going to have complete control over your workforce and over your means of transportation and over your ability to generate or transmit power. So I think the American perspective has to be, we have to communicate why we're the better partners, because we are. And people have to really know that we are better partners, that we're there for the right reasons, and we're there for the longevity and the benefit of both countries, not only ours.
Certainly the Brazilians got caught with a hangover when the commodities prices dropped and the economy sank with Chinese demand. That gentleman right there had a, yes.
Mr. Ambassador, Andres Suskutegui from Georgetown University. We've seen the OAS sort of dip into anti-corruption, anti-impunity in Honduras with MATSI. Is this something that the United States is going to keep supporting, and is the model that maybe we'll see replicated in other countries? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think MATSI has been successful. Obviously, like all organizations, it could get better. So we definitely have an interest in continuing to support MATSI, and MATSI is only as effective as the people who run it. I think we all recognize that. And as far as putting that into the countries have to accept it. everybody, they're sovereigns, and they have to expect an international organization coming in to help them address some of the issues that they're experiencing. So if there's a need, would we be supportive? Absolutely, but I think it's on the sovereign to accept that international help. And I think Masi has done a good job. I think there's room for improvement from all sides, and we look forward to continuing to support it and making it stronger and better for the future.
Would you distinguish it in any way from what CICIG is doing in Guatemala?
Honestly, I couldn't, at this point, I couldn't tell you any massive distinctions. I've spent very little time reviewing. I spent a lot of time reviewing Masi, not so much time with CICIG.
That's very good. One last question, the gentleman there.
Thank you. I wanted to commend Ambassador Trujillo, and then you have a great role model in Ambassador Noriega. Just for the people to know, I have the opportunity to witness Ambassador Trujillo in his first assignment during the summit. There is two groups of Castro and Chavez, Maduro, a sponsor, yelling, insulting the ambassador, trying to lynch a Cuban dissident, Rosa Maria Payá. Most of the ambassadors left the room, and the reason we were not lynched was because Ambassador Trujillo stayed there, so security has to stay with him, but otherwise it was very brave from you to stay with us there. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a great way to end this. Would you plan? He said nice things about me.
We should quit while we're ahead.
He could have stopped right there, as far as I was concerned. But no, that's remarkable testament to your leadership, because what it is it's the United States stepping up, and you have some terrific role models in Secretary of State Pompeo, certainly Ambassador Haley, our other major multilateral ambassador, who are not shy. President Trump is not shy either about American values, and so it's good to hear that you are stepping up in a very serious way, giving those people who don't have a voice the opportunity to be heard. And I think, quite frankly, your responses to the grueling line of inquiry that we submitted you to here were rather remarkable and admirable, and speak well of our positive expectations for your service at the Organization of American States. God bless.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Absolutely. Great event. Thank you.
Extraordinarily good.